What I think, what I thought I will do is to give you a kind of short introduction to Indian cinema itself, because, it's 100 years since the first Indian film was released, and we are, in 1913, and we are in 2013 now. From then to now, lots of very interesting things have happened in the cinema. To start off with, when cinema was silent, the first Indian film was released in 1913. Gandhiji came back to India from South Africa just about 10 months after that. Now, during this time, when films started to be made in India, there were two ideas that were very current, particularly in middle-class India at that time. One was the idea of Swaraj, and the other was that of Swadeshi. Now, these two things were very important. One, of course, was the emphasis on doing things for yourself, Swadeshi, and the boycotting of foreign goods, etc. And the other one, of course, was freedom itself, to become free. Now, both these ideas started to come into the cinema almost from the very inception of cinema in India. You will find that film after film after film, however elliptically, tangentially, and so on and so forth, the films always had a referential point. And the reference point was always these two ideas, Swaraj and Swadeshi. So you had somebody like Dadasaheb Phalke making the kind of films he was doing, much of it with kind of mythological subjects. But what he was doing was actually seen in many ways as a kind of nationalist act. Similarly, even when Jamshedji Tata started the first steel mill in India, that was seen as a nationalist act too. So there was a certain kind of an atmosphere of that time. And when films started to be made, one after the other, if you look at, say, by 1921 or so, there were films in different parts of India, mostly Bombay, Calcutta at that time. There was a filmmaker called Dhiren Ganguly. He made a film called Bilet Farat, which is England Returned. Now that film hit the censors. Censors didn't want that film to be released. So that was really the beginning of censorship in this country. After that, there was a film that Balji Pandarka made, which was called, I don't know what it was called, whatever it was called, it was banned. Now that particular film was banned, which meant that censorship was here to stay. It has remained from then to now. And of course, we have constantly been attacking the censors, in independent India, saying that it comes again, it restricts our freedom of speech and freedom of expression and so on and so forth. The funny part of it is, since the day before yesterday, the attack on the censor board has been from one of the state governments. It's quite amazing, what this whole kind of turnaround. And the state government was questioning in the High Court of Chennai, the Advocate General of Chennai, of the Tamil Nadu government, said that the censor board has no competence to pass a film. Not only did he say that, he said it's buyable. They have no competence. It's a buyable commodity, getting a censor certificate. Now this man is the Advocate General of the government in Tamil Nadu about an institution that has been set up under the central government. So it's quite extraordinary turn of events. Anyway, I'm sorry I went into that, but I wanted to start off by saying that censorship in India started then for the cinema, and it has remained with us ever since. Now, when sound actually came, Indian cinema actually came into its own at that time. Because with the sound, you could, in fact, get your entire urban theatre into film. And the urban theatre, of course, we know what was happening at that time. You had Parsi Urdu theatre, you had Bhangwadi in Bombay, among the Gujarati theatre, then you had Natya theatre, that is Marathi theatre, and so on. And all of them followed a certain kind of form, and that particular form is both very folk as well as very classical as far as India is concerned, because it follows a certain kind of rules and so on of dramaturgy. And our films took from that straight off. And we continued with that thing. And the most important elements there, which are two, one was great rhetorical dialogue, and the other one was song. Music and rhetorical dialogue became the most important features in popular Indian cinema from then, in fact, even to now. You continue to have that character because, we love our wah-wah dialogues. Because when you go to the cinema, you remember, it's very few countries in the world that people remember dialogues from films. But in India, people do remember dialogues from films. They remember dialogues from films, they remember songs from films. Often they don't necessarily remember the stories of the films. The narrative may have been forgotten, but dialogues are not forgotten. So that became a very important element when sound came to India. But even at that time, you will find that there's always a connection between films being made and what the political context of the country was, or the social context of the country, and so on. If you look at the films made by Prabhat Film Company in the 1930s, you'll find that a lot of social reform ideas come into films at that time, whether it is films like Dunya Na Mane, which is about, widow remarriage and so on, and then you have other kinds of films like that were being made by Prabhat, which touched upon gender issues, caste issues, and so on. And then you had Bombay Talkies making Achut Kanya. You find there's always a kind of social connection between the films that were being made here, all the way into the 40s. And when you come into the 40s, then the political aspects become more important because the politics had taken center stage by that time, and you had this business of communal politics raising its head seriously. So you have a lot of films that go into this situation and always suggesting unity of the country. And you will find that all our films from then and continuing after that, after independence, they've always stressed on secularism, the idea that we are a secular society. Now this is a very interesting development. Nobody forced it on our filmmakers. But the reason for their doing it also, particularly in the Hindi cinema, I think, was because Hindi cinema saw itself as the national cinema because it was shown in most parts of the country. And because it was seen in most parts of the country, they had to have something that would be common to all of them. So they had to spread that sense of commonality. So many things happened. Of course, the idea that, we are one and it doesn't matter what caste you are and so on and so forth, which meant that in our films, we always had first names, no surnames. Because if you had surnames, you would know, what caste you belong to, where you come from in India, and so on and so forth. The idea of unity was conveyed through the idea of giving people only first names. That was one aspect of it. Then there are other aspects also simultaneously with it, that you never gave, in the identity of an individual, was never in terms, not only of caste, of anything except religion, because that you couldn't avoid. So you had Hindu characters or maybe Christian characters, and then you had Muslim characters. And the only ones you could actually identify specifically belonging to a community were Muslims. And you had that process developing, continuing, until, of course, we had partition. And after partition, you had this situation. But it became increasingly awkward, because how do you depict a Muslim? Because after partition, you had a Muslim nation who was your neighbor. And you have Muslims in India as well. So how do you treat an Indian Muslim? So if you look at popular cinema from then, until I put the date as 1971, until 1971, you will find that Muslim characters, by and large, are always seen as very good, very kind, very gentle, and then usually they are peripheral people, but the fact is in that peripheral area, they occupy things like, he's a very kindly, uncle type, grandfather type of person, who's, kindly neighbor and stuff like that.